everyone. My name is Melissa Noel. It is my honor to welcome you to Remembering the Revolutionary, a conversation about Toni Morrison, Chinua Achebe, and John R. Lewis, three phenomenal luminaries whose works will have a lasting impact on the hearts and minds of many, many around the world. Today, I am delighted to introduce to you the moderator of this distinguished panel of speakers, Dr. Carsonia Wise Whitehead, known to many as Dr. K, a three-time New York Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and associate professor of Loyola University, Maryland. You may have also been fortunate to hear her on WEAA radio on her popular show Today with Dr. K. Please welcome a great mother, a great wife, a great community member, a great global member, and the 2019 Essence Magazine Woke 100 selectee. Yes, the incredible Dr. K. Wise Whitehead.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here to have a conversation to talk about how our work has been influenced and framed and really moved by some very particular revolutionaries, some people whose steps and footsteps that we walk in as we try to be better as writers, as we try to be better as researchers, and in John Lewis's case, as we try to be better as global citizens. Each author is going to begin by framing the revolutionary that they are focused on. I want to introduce all of them first, and then we'll start with Dr. Carey. Dr. Tamika Carey is an interdisciplinary scholar and teacher. She's an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Virginia. She is the author of Rhetorical Healing, the Re-Education of Contemporary Black Womanhood. We're also joined by Helan Habila, who was born in Nigeria. He teaches creative writing at George Mason University. He is the author of 4 books, most recently Travelers, about African migrants in Europe. And we're joined by Dr. Janice View, an associate professor emerita at George Mason University. She is the author of Anti-Racist Professional Development for In-Service Teaching and the co-editor of Putting the Movement Back into Civil Rights Teaching, when the first edition did have a foreword by John Lewis. I want to start with Dr. Carey, who's going to frame Toni Morrison.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. K. And thank you to the Fall Festival of the Book for the opportunity to talk about Toni Morrison. I would like to begin with a reflection. The morning word broke that Toni Morrison had passed away. I received a text message from Simone, one of my former undergraduate advisees, who now teaches middle school in Brooklyn. Her text message read, "I got the update and had to step away from my students. My heart is broken. You're the only person I wanted to share this moment with." Simone was not the only student I spoke with that day in August 2019. There was Sarah, an undergraduate working under my direction on an honors thesis about Morrison's 2008 novel, A Mercy, a project wherein Sarah would argue that Morrison had created what she called a pre-connotation text, or one that illuminated the ills of slavery before the institution became coded as Black within our country's historical social imaginary. There were also colleagues like the Renaissance professor who reached out to me through social media, remembering how I gushed about reading Sula for the first time in undergrad, Morrison's second novel, and how that experience transformed my understanding of Black women's sacrifices for their families and their abilities to sometimes be soulmates for each other through their deep and lasting friendships. Indeed, for the rest of that day and many after, I had these brief exchanges, conversations of reunion, if you will, about the deep impact of Toni Morrison's life and work. I am a rhetorician by training and a feminist by choice. So I gravitate towards the conversations Black women have been able to recover and ignite, remix and disrupt when the grounds for them to do so have been hostile. Morrison's work is a magnet that has drawn me and so many others to it time and time again. This pull seems to have been one of her aspirations. Since the late 60s, when she was working as a book editor for Random House, work that involved publishing collections on contemporary African literature that included the writings of the late Chinua Achebe, and amplifying the works of writers like Toni Morrison. Morrison turned to her own craft and published The Bluest Eye in 1970. And I see this turn as a reflection of her commitment to telling the totality of the African American experience. By using one of the most intimate conversations an individual can have, her protagonist, the young Pecola Breedlove's prayer that God would give her blue eyes, and constructing the circumstances that would lead to it and the consequences of it, Morrison unmasked the deep psychic depths of self-loathing, colorism, and abuse for African Americans and young Black women in particular that result from a white supremacist culture. We did not yet have the language of what Moya Bailey and Trudy would call misogynoir, or specifically anti-Black misogyny, when The Bluest Eye debuted in 1970. But when we think of Morrison's frequently quoted advice to write the book that, quote, hasn't been written yet, it is obvious that the conversation she had about this facet of the Black experience continues to reverberate. And while The Bluest Eye laid bare some of the uglier discourses that can impact and circulate within Black communities, Morrison's Pulitzer Prize-winning 1987 novel, Beloved, left us with what I see as one of her most enduring and pivotal contributions to Black life, namely, a vivid illustration of the liberating power of self-definition. The novel, inspired by a short article on Margaret Garner, a Cincinnati woman who had escaped slavery and killed her own children rather than return to it when recaptured, interrupts a historical narrative wherein Garner was positioned as an animal through a probing exploration of the conditions that would lead to such an unimaginable act and the interior and social consequences of it. Morrison was expansive in this work, tracking the landscapes of Setha, her protagonist, throughout her life and leaving for readers mandates for healing. At Sweet Home, for example, the Kentucky plantation Setha escapes, the sadistic overseer named School Teachers comments that, quote, definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined, shows us how language shapes and or remakes an individual's subjectivity. In The Clearing, the hush harbor in the woods, where Setha's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, renders sermons to the Black community, charging them to love themselves because, quote, over yonder, they do not love your flesh. Morrison showed us how racial terror preserves a group's need for spaces of safety and affirmation. At 124, the house where Setha descends into a prison built by her community's judgment and the guilt of her actions, we hear Paul D., another survivor of Sweet Home, remind Setha that she is, quote, her own best thing. A message to Black women in particular that they cannot neglect self-care in the wake of generational trauma. Of course, Beloved is one of the pivotal literary contributions to what we may now call slavery studies. But with this haunting tale, Morrison also enriched the tradition of Black women writers. Authors like Alice Walker, Gail Jones, Margaret Walker, Maya Angelou, and so many others. Writers who have made history a balm, reconstructing and fleshing out and extending conversations about Black life, These writers seize the inspiration and the authority to heal their readers by locating in language a new curative domain of experiences, of memories and possibilities, and by using language as a form of preventative and restorative agency. It is in this idea of restorative agency and possibility, of repair and prevention, of memory and cure, of flesh and conversation, of authority and healing, where I see the deepest impact of Morrison's literary contributions to our life. 11 novels, a National Book Critics Circle Award, an American Book Award, an American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters Award, a National Humanities Medal, a Pulitzer Prize Award for fiction, honorary doctorates from Rutgers, Vanderbilt, Harvard, Princeton, the University of Oxford, and the University of Geneva, and the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize for Literature, a distinction that afforded her the opportunity to share this following life philosophy with us. As she wrote, and I quote, "We die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives." Toni Morrison, An Immeasurable Impact of Revolutionary Life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carey. I would like to go now to Professor Hellon, who's going to frame Chinua Achebe.
Oh, thank you very much. Hope you can hear me. Where does one begin, describing Chinua Achebe? I think the best place would be to kind of describe how I first met him. I met him in 2005. I was living in England then at that time, and he was teaching at Bard College, where he had been based since the 1990s. After his accident, he had an accident that paralyzed him, and he was given this job at Bard College. And I was in England, and the phone rang, and my wife said that Chinua Achebe is on the phone for you. I said, "No way." She said, "Yeah." So I answered the phone, and it was him. And he asked me if I wanted to come to the US to be the first Chinua Achebe Fellow at Bard College. And I said, "Of course." And so that's really how it began. And I got here, I was picked up from the airport by the contact person, and I was tired and jet lagged. And he asked me if I wanted to go and rest, or if I wanted to go and see Chinua Achebe first. I said, of course I wanted to see Chinua Achebe. So meeting him for me as an African writer, a young African writer, was, it's almost like, meeting God. He's been described as the father of African literature, and there's a reason for that. One of the main reasons is because when his first book came out, Things Fall Apart in 1958, there wasn't anything like African literature. When I say literature, I mean written literature. Of course, there were oral literatures and other forms of literatures. And there had been novels here and there, some of them published in South Africa, by churches and missionaries, and kind of autobiographical tracts written by Africans. And of course, Amos Tutuola, another African writer, had published his book before Chinua Achebe. But why Chinua Achebe is often described as the father is because of the systematic way that he went about writing his novel, carefully mixing the oral tradition with the written tradition, because he had, read English and literature at the University of Ibadan. So he was trained in the British classic tradition of the novel. So he wanted to fuse this Western art form with the oral. So that was systematic, and he kind of showed the way to other writers that we don't just have to go on imitating this foreign art form that was, given to Africa by the British. We also have our literature, which is as valid and as important, as powerful as this written literature. But how do we fuse them together? and he did it practically and showed that it could be done. So that was one thing that kind of made people begin to call him the father of African literature. Now, to go back to the writing of the book itself, he has said many times that what inspired him to write Things Fall Apart was because of his reading of books like Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in which African characters are portrayed as, basically they're just, to use the language of TVs, they're just extras. They have no speaking parts. And if they're shown, they're always shown as savages, barbaric, and that is also in keeping with the tradition of writing about Africa by explorers and, colonial officers and their wives with their diaries and other things that they wrote about Africa in order to justify colonialism itself and imperialism. And before that, it was used to justify slavery. The Africans basically were not human. So we're actually doing them a favor by enslaving them or by colonizing them or by subjugating them. So this was the tradition of writing about Africa. And this was, of course, by the foreigner. So there was this gaze that was turned towards Africa by this tradition of writing that Achebe said, I really don't see myself in this literature. I'm an African, and I don't think you're speaking for me. So he started to write back, which he is one of the earliest practitioners of what we call post-colonial literature. And to do that, you have to tell your own story. And that's basically what he set about doing, to show, one, that Africa had religion before the coming of the white man, that Africa had culture before the coming of the white man, that Africa had its, judicial system and everything you could think of that a civilization has. Africa had it. So he doesn't just say that we had it, Africa had it, but to demonstrate it, which is the hardest thing to do in your fiction. When you read Things Fall Apart, it's the story of Okonkwo, an African chief, strong man, who is, who epitomizes his culture and his times. And this culture kind of valorizes the male, strong African who had these many wives and property and all of that. That was the value system at that time. And what he shows there, and that's the genius of the novel, is that it's not just that colonialism came and destroyed Africa, but before colonialism, there were also things that were happening in Africa that kind of made it possible, because you can never subjugate the people without their own collaboration. So he was kind of even-handed in showing the picture of Africa at that time. So he said maybe Africa was too ready. It was kind of ready for that thing to happen at that time, but that didn't justify all the narratives, about Africa that were written at that time. The other thing that he did, I think, brilliantly in Things Fall Apart is the use of language. And this is one of the things that African writers have always debated about. Up till today, people talk about African literature in English and in European languages. Why do we write in African languages, in European languages, when the very definition of a national literature should be a literature written in a national language? But the argument that Achebe brought forward at that time, and this was in 1968 when there was a conference at Makerere University in Uganda, when African writers got together to discuss the future of African literatures. Mm-hmm. And some were on the side of writing only in African languages, and others were kind of more amenable to writing literature in foreign languages, including English and French, of course, and Spanish and Portuguese. And Achebe's argument was that if you can master a language and you can use it well, there's no reason why you shouldn't use it to write whatever you want to write. But that's not all. he said that it's a kind of justice, it's a kind of poetic justice to take a language that was used to subjugate you and turn it into the tool, into the instrument of telling your own story and basically freeing yourself. So he was always conscious of this political dimension of language because language is the tool that was used for mental colonization. There was always the physical colonization of the land, and people and all that. But the more insidious colonization was the mental one, and that only happened through language. So these are the important things I think that Chinua Achebe achieved with Things Fall Apart and his other novels, which are kind of often overlooked. Novels like No Longer at Ease, A Man of the People, Antilles of the Savannah, and of course his numerous essays. One of them is Home and Exile, which was a collection of lectures that he gave at Harvard University, I think in 1990s. This brilliant, brilliant reflection on exile and what it means to be a writer living outside your country, and how he said that he wished, that he could go back to Nigeria and live in Nigeria, but the conditions were not kind of favorable for his return at that time. And there's an interview that I just finished reading, one of his interviews, many interviews that he gave. And he was talking about Africa being where it is and the way that people talk about Africa. And this has always been, his argument, that Africa is not progressing the way it should progress. Democracy is not successful in Africa. But he said that this argument often turns a blind eye to the history and the conditions that brought Africa to this position. You had colonialism, which basically cut off a whole continent from its culture and its religion and other in its worldview, which is a deeply traumatic thing to happen. All the gods that your ancestors have worshipped and all that, in one day you're cut off from them. Your whole worldview is like throwing a person into a void, into a darkness, because there's nothing. Everything that your culture has developed, you are told is a lie. So there is that. So when you look at the failures, and we're not excusing, the failures of African countries, of course, there's always the failure of the leaders themselves, but you have to take that into recognition that there is this historical factors that contributed to that. So these are the things that Achebe has always talked about in his writings, in his speeches. And there are so many things to say about him. I could go on and on, but I guess I should, stop here and just say that he was the father of African literature, and his legacy is always going to be with us.
Thank you, Professor Helon. I want to go now to Dr. Janice View, who's going to frame John Lewis for our conversation.
Thank you, Dr. K. I hope you can hear me okay. I sometimes have audio issues. Can you hear me okay?
Fine.
Great. So when I was first approached about framing John Robert, as he liked to be called, John Robert Lewis, Representative John Robert Lewis, my first thought was that he was not a writer. Certainly a revolutionary, for sure, but my initial thought was that he's not a writer. And then a couple of things happened. When he passed away, I was surprised at the number of young people in my world and all across the internet who had photographs of themselves standing next to him, where he was embracing them, conferring advice, sharing his story with them. And I thought, that's interesting how many of those photographs there were. And then I thought about, of course, everybody was talking about his first public speech being his speech at the 1963 March on Washington. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And how of the many speeches that day, outside of Dr. King's speech that everybody refers to as the I Have a Dream speech, the only other memorable speech was the one by John Robert Lewis. And I thought, well, those are words. And then more importantly, I came to understand, as I think we all have, that his body and his soul and his heart was a text. He told a narrative about not only being a Black man in America, but being a Black person in America for a particular part of our history that was transformative, and in which he became an author of that story as much as he was. So he was a protagonist, he was an author. He gave speeches, and so I'll talk a bit about those speeches as well, that became text. And so everything about him was a narrative that was a really powerful narrative, and he was acting as a revolutionary in the course of doing his work and living his life. So he first talks about how when he was 15 years old, he was a year older than Emmett Till when he was murdered in 1955 in Money, Mississippi, and how that was a searing event for him. It was the same as for a lot of people when Trayvon Martin died, and they were close in age to Trayvon Martin, or the age of George Floyd, or the age of Breonna Taylor, et cetera. It was a galvanizing, frightening, horrifying moment if you were a contemporary of one of the people who was murdered by white supremacy in this country. And how for a moment he was paralyzed by fear because he realized how close he could come to a similar fate. And then shortly thereafter heard the voice over the radio of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talking about nonviolent struggle, talking about the need to take action against white supremacy. And then he became galvanized to act. In 1960, 61, he was one of the first freedom riders to desegregate interstate bus transportation in this country. He became one of the early sit-in participants, putting his body on the line to integrate lunch counters. And people tend to think of that now, especially if you're a young person, you're saying, well, why would anybody burn out cigarette butts on a person's head just because they wanted to sit at the lunch counter? Why would somebody bomb a bus because they wanted to ride a bus in the United States? Without understanding the nature of white supremacy and the way it infected every single aspect of our lives as people of color, as African Americans in particular. And so the fact that they were willing to put their bodies on the line, John Lewis was willing to put his body on the line to say, no, we should be allowed to sit wherever we choose. We should be allowed to eat wherever we choose. We should be allowed to go to libraries. We should be allowed to go to school. We should be, and putting his body on the line in that way, in a nonviolent way, was a text. And all of that happened before his first public speech in 1963 of the March of Washington. So he was by then the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was invited as the youngest person to speak at that march. And the speech he wrote is not the speech he gave. The speech he wrote was extremely radical and revolutionary. He was arguing forcefully for the use of nonviolence to tear down Jim Crow and white supremacy. But he used phrasing like, we will go through the South like Sherman did after the Civil War to burn down the last vestiges of white supremacy. We will do it nonviolently. He talked very, very strongly in revolutionary terms about what needed to happen to change this country, not just from the political perspective, but from the economic perspective, a social perspective. The elders who were organizing the march were, let's just say, more politic than he. They were concerned that the purpose of the march was to try to transform federal policy, that they perceived President Kennedy as a potential ally in that work. And they didn't want to frighten not only President Kennedy and the moderates in the Democratic Party, but they certainly did not want to inflame the Dixiecrats, the hardcore segregationist Democrats who were already afraid of the march and already afraid of the outcome and predicted violence. So they asked him, please, to moderate the speech, to edit it, And there were some people who were concerned that by doing that, he was selling out the revolutionary message of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He relented because he so much revered Reverend King, so much revered him as a father figure and a person who was leading, or one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. And so he agreed to tone down the language. That was his first education in politics. And subsequently, as he moved through his life and then eventually became a congressman himself, went on to give multiple speeches that were powerful and that spoke to his life as text. So in addition to the March on Washington, there was his speech to the Democratic National Convention in 1988. There was his speech in 1996 concerning the Defense of Marriage Act, where he argued, you know, how is it that we can legislate love? How is it that his exact language was, you know, you cannot tell people they cannot fall in love. His speech on the groundbreaking for the Martin Luther King Memorial in 2006 was a powerful speech. At the Selma's 50th anniversary march, and finally the impeachment of Donald Trump in 2019, all of these were significant marches that spoke to his passion for justice, his passion for holding the U.S. accountable for its promises, his belief that we needed to do better to make our work real, to make our nation real, to make our nation live up to its promises. So I think his final text, if you will, was the essay that he wrote and asked to have delivered upon his death, where he's impressing upon people the need to keep working, that the work of the Black Lives Matter uprisings and movement and all the other social movements in this country were part of what it meant to be, as he says, ordinary citizens, ordinary people with extraordinary vision who can redeem the soul of America by getting in what he called good trouble, necessary trouble. So while he was not a writer in the sense of Toni Morrison or Chinua Achebe, he wrote his life. He wrote, in many ways, an important history of this country. He wrote with his own body, his support for social change and the U.S. living up to its promises. And so in that way, he was both a writer and a revolutionary.
Thank you, Dr. View. I want to come back to you, Tamika, about Toni Morrison, a writer who has challenged me in so many ways to see beyond what's on the page, because she had this incredible vision when she spoke with us about really understanding how to move out of the white gaze and learn to see yourself and see our people differently. People know about The Bluest Eye and Sula and of course Beloved, but the book that really challenged me by Morrison is Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, where she really delves into white gaze. Can you talk a bit about how Toni Morrison worked to come out of the white gaze and really forced us to kind of view ourselves a different way?
Thank you for that question. You know, Morrison as literary critic is a part that I did not really touch upon in my reflection, but I like the way that you framed that question in terms of pushing us to not see ourselves through the eyes of the other, but to give us a kind of complex and total vision of African American life and communities. I think some of that comes from the deep historicizing and contextualizing. I love in some of her other projects how she works to, if we can take, for example, the introduction to Sula and how you can see her traveling, this kind of narrative eye, bringing you all the way into this town, or just her perspective, the interior dialogues. And I think those are narrative choices that, again, reflect her refusal to give priority to the white gaze. I'm also thinking of other interviews that she gave about being asked to write for white audiences and defiantly saying that is not her project. And so both in commitment as well as technique, we see her moving away from a paradigm, you know, forced or thrust upon a lot of Black authors of her day to cater to the white masses.
Professor Helan, in thinking about Chinua Achebe, who I discovered when I was at college, I went to an HBCU, and our professors made sure they put Things Fall Apart into our hands. Got that in the Bible, a Morrison book, and an Alice Walker book, and you were starting on your journey. But the book that really moved me by him, after I got through Things Fall Apart, I read Arrow of God, where he talks about, you know, the refusal to be compromised. In fact, one of his quotes that he really pulls out is that is what it means, that one of the truest tests of integrity is its blunt refusal to be compromised. Can you talk about how Chinua Achebe refused to be compromised in his work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think when you read his essays and you read his books, what strikes you the most is the integrity that he brings to his work and to his worldview and to his craft as a writer. And he's always had these guiding principles. And I think the most important is his realization that, first of all, you know, he is an African writer, and he's writing within a historical context. He always references his past, you know, his history as the thing that informs everything that he does today. And that, I think, kept him in this path, you know, of integrity as a writer. Because, you know, there's so much you can do, especially a person who is a colonized person. The whole idea of being colonized is to be this person who is half African and half European. Mm-hmm. And by that very fact, you're already compromised. So he is showing for the first time. Most people kind of took that for granted. We all grew up, you know, educated in the British system, speaking English language, and basically in this Western society or Westernized African society. But his argument is always that you have to go back to begin to understand where you're coming from. If you don't do that, if you cannot get that, then you can never be effective as a spokesperson or as a writer or as a person that creates culture for your people. And I think that for him is always important. And for me as a writer, I think for a lot of younger people who came after him, that is very important. We always go back to that understanding. You are an African, you are a Black person, you're coming from a very, very proud tradition of literature and history and all that. So you can always draw upon that, you know, to strengthen your art and to kind of be a kind of light for you on the path that you're going as a writer.
I love that. It makes me think about the whole notion of Sankofa, which Melissa, our host, was talking about, right? Moving forward with your body while looking back with your head from where you've come from, which is an excellent way to think about the work of John Lewis. I love, Dr. View, how you framed him, that, you know, his life was a text that we could all read. Because Representative John Lewis, you know, he lived longer than Dr. King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and Coretta Scott King and Betty Shabazz. If you think about it, we were actually able to see his life played out. What happens when the revolution begins to shift? And so in his final piece that you mentioned, which was entitled "Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation," can you talk about how John Lewis in both his life and in this final text, this op-ed that was published on the day of his funeral. We were all mourning him. How does he challenge us to not just use our bodies and put them on the line, but also use our other tools, our pens on paper, you know, the ways in which we have conversations with one another?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Dr. K, because as you were talking with Halan, my eye fell on a different part of his speech that speaks to this Sankofa spirit, if you will, and I'll just read it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history, because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change. And that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements, stretching across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. And so it's this task, this charge to reference history and reference our ancestors as much as it is to tap into the anger, the disgust, the frustration of the moment, right? Whatever the political moment is that inspires us to act, it's not simply enough to act from emotion, but also to understand the history of many struggles, the strategies that were used, the ideas and the theories that were promoted to support those struggles that are important for us moving forward. I think, you know, people have talked a lot about his use of the term good trouble, necessary trouble, and how that should also be an inspiration to us to not be afraid. The one thing about his life that I failed to mention before that's kind of obvious, of course, was the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, where we witnessed him being brutalized by state troopers, and he almost died. And yet he popped back up almost the next day and said, gotta keep moving, gotta keep going, because if I die in the process of pursuing voting rights for Black people or any other justice for Black people, it will be a life well lived. And he was certainly correct about that. It was a life well lived, and he was willing to die for that. And so I don't necessarily think he was suggesting that we should all be martyrs, as much as that we should be students of history. We should act in nonviolent ways. We should always have integrity and speak our truth, and work in concert with other people who are also fighting a similar struggle for humanity.
Now, I would like to connect the work of revolutionaries for our last question back to your own work, because you're all writers and researchers who are either in the midst of working on a project, you've just finished a project, or you're just starting a project. Toni Morrison once said, if there's a book you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. As a writer and a researcher, when you think about your own work, how would you frame the work that you're doing now to kind of make a project that you hope will move people or inspire them to do something? And so I'll start with Dr. Tamika Carey.
Thank you again for connecting that about the book that you haven't read yet that you need. My project, my research on healing discourses was a result of me not having the adequate language to see all of the discussions about wellness that were being marketed towards Black women. I think sometimes it is difficult to learn how to accurately critique the conversations happening in your own communities when you see the need for them, but you may see some challenges with them. And so it was a project of me coming to voice with how to talk back to things that were talking to me. And so the first project really was a reflection of me kind of embracing that project. My newest research, though, looking at the pushback against Black women intellectuals, is still an effort of healing. I need us to have archives of what happens when outspoken Black intellectuals are attacked on social media, do experience negative consequences. And so looking at impact and consequences, trying to cultivate a critical voice, to me, those are things that Toni Morrison certainly modeled and inspired, and it's a way that I'm hoping to continue moving forward with my own work.
And Dr. Carey is an interdisciplinary scholar and teacher and associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Virginia. Professor Helen, I'll come to you next. In thinking about the way that Chinua Achebe, for many people, he opened up the continent for people, where we were getting all of these narratives around a dark place, a dark hole, that his work spoke to family and resilience and culture and really challenged people's perspective on where Africa sits in general, and then Nigeria, the country more specifically. Can you talk a bit about the work that you're doing now to continue to challenge how people see themselves and how they see the continent?
Yeah. So my novels, my 4 novels that I've written so far have kind of more or less continued in the tradition of writing by earlier African writers like Chinua Achebe. And there's an essay by Wole Soyinka where he described the position of the African writer after independence and the burden, the huge burden of nation building that the African writer often kind of bore, and it still bears. And it makes writing a bit harder because you're often kind of overwhelmed by this awareness that you really have, you are speaking for the nation, that you're nation building. And for some reason, it stops you from really expressing yourself as a person, as an individual, or writing about ordinary, everyday things. So it's always been there. And I think in my novels, like Travelers, the last one that came out last year, it's about African migrants in Europe. The one before it, Oil and Water, is about the Niger Delta and the environmental degradation by oil companies and all that. So my next project is to try as much as I can to just write about ordinary life, if I can, you know, about the ordinary African, to try to show people the Nigeria that I know, that I knew growing up. It's about family, it's about love, it's about sisters and brothers, just people being people, ordinary people, Black people being people, you know, about coping with ordinary things that other people cope with. So that's my next project.
I think it's very interesting to actually have the opportunity and the freedom to write about ordinary people and not have to bear the additional burden of trying to write against white supremacy, write through the white gaze, write as if your people matter, but just to be able to say, you know, I'm just going to write about the ordinary things without it being seen as something that's extraordinary. So I think that's pretty interesting. Dr. View, I'll come to you now. Dr. View is Associate Professor Emerita at George Mason University. So John Lewis, whose life is a tale that we could read. You've done some of this work when you co-edited the volume, putting the movement back into civil rights teaching. Can you talk about the ways in which the work you're doing now is actually helping to open up both us, the ways in which we see the revolution, but also how we teach about it in the classroom?
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. The first edition of that book came out in 2004. And we're hoping that the second edition will come out before the end of 2020. We are prayerful. And of course, in the 16 years since the first edition, many, many things have changed. And of course, unfortunately, some things have stayed exactly the same. When we wrote the first edition of the book, we thought, well, who could we get to write the foreword? Do you think maybe John Lewis would? And again, speaking to that accessibility, that warmth, that he had, he was happy to do it, right? Happy to write the foreword, and was quite celebratory about the work. The book, Putting the Movement Back into Civil Rights Teaching, the first and the second edition, is really a message to classroom teachers, K-12 classroom teachers. We've discovered, of course, that university professors have used it in their classrooms, and community organizations have used it, because it's not a textbook. It's not, it does have lesson plans, and it does have primary sources. And so it's really a complement to any text that somebody might be using to teach about the civil rights movement. But what we know for sure, and this is still true 16 years later, is that textbooks do a really poor job of telling that story. The breadth of the story, they don't talk as much about the women. They don't talk as much about the young people, the children, really, who were as much leaders of the march as the ministers were. They don't talk about the ordinary people who were not in front of the camera or in front of the microphone, but who were feeding people, sheltering people, funding the movement. The intellectual and political strategy that people had. So it wasn't just that people were acting spontaneously as a result of their anger and outrage. They had put a lot of thought into what this meant to tear down an entire structure of politics and economy and social well-being. And also that the civil rights movement did not start in 1954 when the Supreme Court desegregated schools, or in 55 when Emmett Till was murdered, or it didn't end in 1968 when King was assassinated. It's part of this, sort of long river of struggle, and not just African Americans. That many people of color, some white people internationally were part of this movement. And so it's as much a statement of what John Lewis's life was about, without our intending it to be so. And we think that it's a part of this looking back to history to move forward, the Sankofa that we talked about.
Now, we're in a particular season as we wrap up here, and I think about Michelle Obama when she spoke about the importance of the vote, and she told people, pack your lunch, pack your dinner, take a blanket if you have to, and be prepared to stand in line because this is the most important vote that you may ever experience. Well, I've been telling people, if you have to stand in line, if that's what you must do, then you have to take a book with you, right? So while you're standing there, take something to inspire you while you're standing and waiting to vote. So I want to come back around, starting with Dr. Carey. Going to stand in line, what book would you recommend that people take? For me, I tell people, take Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Like, that'll make you angry enough that you will stand there as long as it takes until you get to the voting table. What would you recommend, Dr. Carey?
Wow, it's difficult to narrow this down to one, but I am a Claudia Rankine fan. And so I like Citizen a lot. I really appreciate what she shows. It is not necessarily a feel-good book, but maybe sometimes we don't need to feel good when we are acting towards, progressing democracy on our behalf. So I would say Claudia Rankine, Citizen.
Professor Helon Habila, what would you tell people, take with you if you have to stand in line all day to vote in this very important election? What book would you recommend they take with them?
I would suggest Chinua Achebes, surprise, surprise, A Man of the People by Chinua Achebe, which is one of his least known books, and it's written in a different vein from his other books. It's a comedy. It's very hilarious. It makes you laugh, but it's also about elections in Nigeria and the stealing of people's mandate. There was a coup d'etat, in 1966, and the book was actually written before the coup d'etat happened, and it kind of almost prophesied, and Achebe almost got into trouble because the military said that he knew about the coup before it happened. But that shows you the prophetic powers of literature and of writing. But most importantly, it's about the importance of democracy and of kind of ensuring that your voice is heard, and you must never let people steal your vote. So I guess it's quite relevant in these times.
Could you say the name of the book again, Professor Helon? Because I'm taking notes here.
A Man of the People.
A Man of the People. Thank you very much. And Dr. View, what would you recommend?
So I would have to recommend Barbara Ransby's book, which was the biography of Ella Baker. Ella Baker was the person who helped to bring the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to life. She was 54 years old at the time that she stood between the Black ministers who wanted to control the movement and the young revolutionaries like John Lewis who wanted to take it to another level. She made sure they had money. She made sure they had institutions to support them. She made sure that they understood the need for really good, strong debate to move a movement forward and to have good strategy. And she was a person who operated in the background. We don't hear her name enough when we talk about the civil rights movement in particular. And so knowing her story, her very long and wonderful and amazing story, and in particular the way that she shepherded movements, several movements over the course of the middle 20th century into the 21st century would be a really important read.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Tamika Carey. Thank you, Professor Helen Habila. Thank you, Dr. Janice Yu. We would also like to thank Melissa Green for organizing this fall for the book. We'd like to thank George Mason University's English Department, the Creative Writing segment, for sponsoring this event. And of course, Fall for the Book and the support of Susie Rigdon. We appreciate your time and your support in the effort as we move forward to celebrate our authors. Thank you.